strange. Well, go ahead and get high then. Come on. Well, there's the FaceTime video. Okay. Always display participant name on the videos. Always show video preview. Hey, folks, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you see me?
I cannot.
Yeah, me neither. So this is strange. Now, I had it a minute ago. And it's gone. So this is very strange. I wonder what's going on here. There we go. Okay. I don't know what happened there. Very strange. Gremlins, I think. Okay. Oh, it's my FaceTime video. It's not my camera. That's strange. Okay. Back to plan A. Well, it is what it is. Okay. How are we doing here? Let's check the waiting room. Looks like we might have a small group tonight. Yeah.
Hey.
Oh, hey, how are you?
All right, how are you?
Good, good. I'm just sorting out some quick video gremlins here and trying to make sure I don't leave anybody in the waiting room, and we'll start.
Okay.
James. Very good. Chat room. Lighting is on point. What does that mean? Oh, to answer Dawn's question, no, I do not have another app open with the camera on. So good question, though. I think I might be burning up my video card. I didn't spend a lot of money on it, so it might be that I have taxed it just too much and have to get a more expensive one. Oh, my looks a little warm on my FaceTime camera. The tone's a little shifted magenta, but on my, well, what would have been my GH5, it's a much cooler image, which makes the highlight sometimes a little hotter, depending on what shirt I'm wearing, whether it's a dark shirt or a lighter shirt. I'd whip the laptop around and let you have a look at what I got going on here, but I'm a little squeezed in here. So, but I'm using one of those roll up LED mats. Um, I went with the Falcon Eyes brand because they're cheaper than the Westcott, and cheaper than the Light Gear as well. But the color is, if you buy the daylight only, I haven't tested the bicolor, but the daylight only color balance is perfect. So it works really, really well. And it's about, I don't know, 18 by, I guess it's 18 by 24 inches. And you can, roll it up and it comes in a little sock. And it comes with a little kind of frame so you can build the frame and then poof, pop the thing out, and it's a nice flat corner to corner flat soft panel that I have then rigged in a boom arm. So it's out, the stand is over here off camera and it booms out over, and it's about, I don't know, 45 degrees down on my forehead there. So it's just one key, and then I got a little eye light right here. I don't know if you can see that, but it just sort of digs in underneath, gets rid of some of my, we'll call them laugh lines. Fills in under the eyes a little bit, and that's it. Let's see. Okay, I guess, oh, one more. Here we go. Okay, I want to get started because this will be a little bit longer session tonight than we're normally used to, because I got to get through a lot of material, but I'm going to try and go quicker. Last night it was a while. It was over 2 hours, so I don't really want to repeat that if at all possible. So I'm going to try and go through this session fairly quickly, and hopefully to alleviate some of that, I've given you guys an extra PDF in your downloadable PDF section on web courses, where you can read up on some of the stuff about sensors that I'm going to talk about with you to get the full explanation of what's going on with sensors relative to your data capture, because I want to talk to you about data cards and color sampling and stuff like that tonight. So it'll be our first technical conversation of this semester. So please bear with me. It's like I said, it is more technical than we've addressed so far this semester. I think it's probably about as technical as it's going to get in terms of details and so forth. So just bear with me, and it should be pretty painless. I want to ask you guys a favor, though. I'm asking all my classes now to please turn on your video cameras, unless you have some technical issue that prohibits you from doing so. I would love to see your smiling, happy faces. And you don't have to turn on your microphones. You can leave those muted until you want to respond or ask a question or provide some feedback. But if at all possible, unless it's going to crash your computer for some reason, because of bandwidth or whatever, I would love for you to turn your cameras on, please. Okay, let me get into screen share mode and we'll get this party started. Okay, so what we have here is week 4. We're in section 4. The videos from the lecture, I'm not going to show them in real time tonight. I'm just going to refer to them, and then you can find them here, and you can watch them at your leisure. There's a few of them, not too bad, but you can check them out and you can watch them as many times as you want. Just access them here. I put your downloadable PDFs here with a new edition that I added today. So if you haven't checked this page in a while, you might want to look at that really quick. I did add an additional PDF there for you for reference. And then this is your homework assignment. If anybody's got any questions about that, I noticed that a couple of you have already turned it in. So you're either extremely brave or you're pretty well versed in the content of that worksheet. So if that's the case, that's fine. Okay. So I want to talk to you about data from the point of view of the camera and how it's creating it and how you are capturing it. So this is Cinematography 1, where images are sweet. Okay, here's the outline for tonight. We're going to talk about media, a little bit about formats, and very, very briefly about compression. Okay. And I want to leave you with one sort of salient point for the evening, which will be this. In the course of the semester, I'm going to talk to you about a lot of stuff, a lot of tech, and I'll talk to you about gear, and we'll talk about how to use it and principles behind the crafting of images. And every so often, the question comes up, and somebody asks, "What's the best camera?" or "What's the best camera for cinematography?" To which I can only give one effective answer, and that is the one you can put your hands on right now and go out and shoot something if you so desire. Okay, so um, that's going to create a lot of conflict with people who have specific ideas about what constitutes a good camera and what doesn't. And I just want to stress to you that the specs of a camera sometimes are the least of your concern, and really it's about access. Um, and along with specs, if you always try to get the most uh, spec capable camera, the camera with the quote unquote best technical performance, um, it may put you at a budgetary deficit to think that way. And what I'd rather see you do is choose a camera based on what your project requires, what your images call for, or what your shooting criteria are, right? Rather than just trying to determine a best possible camera and use, you know, a shotgun to kill a fly instead of a fly swatter sometimes. You know what I mean? So the best camera, I think, is the one that you can put your hands on right now and go out and shoot something. So if that's if that's a pocket cinema camera, great. If that's an Ursa Mini, great. If it's an Arri Alexa, great. If it's your cell phone, that's okay too, provided you use that tool, and it is a tool. All cameras are tools. So as long as you use that tool to its best advantage in the situation that you want to shoot under, play to its strengths and try to downplay its weaknesses, or avoid the weaknesses, or use the weaknesses as a creative solution to using an inferior camera. For instance, 28 days later, when Danny Boyle was shooting the first zombie installment, they shot a lot of that stuff on I think they were Sony Hi8 cameras, consumer video cameras, and some prosumer video cameras. I think they had some DVXs in there, standard def stuff, not even high definition, and then mixed all that content in with footage from 16mm cameras. And so there was a lot of different uh, sources of image capture. And the idea was that some of those images needed to look really gritty and really primitive and low quality because it sort of fit into the post-apocalyptic storyline. He didn't really want pristine looking images in a movie that was supposed to be about, um, zombies and um, the degradation of society and the post-apocalyptic mess that the world was in after the zombie apocalypse. So
Kind of sounds like Fallout without the nuclear war.
yeah, something like that. Whatever the premise was, the idea was the images shouldn't be pretty and they shouldn't be perfect, so let's use some tools that are going to be easy to acquire, cheap to rent or cheap to buy, but are going to give us the right feeling images, which is, imperfect, um, gritty, primitive images. And I think it worked. I think he pulled it off. Okay. The recording factors that I want to address this evening, sensors and aspect ratio, pixels, resolution, bits versus bytes, what's bit rate, and I'll talk to you a little bit about compression and a little bit about color science, and we'll address those issues again later in the semester. So I don't want to hover too long on those particular talking points. So let's start with aspect ratio. So when I think about aspect ratio and think about having conversations about aspect ratio, I always think of Wes Anderson and I always think of Grand Budapest Hotel. And the reason why is because throughout the filming of Grand Budapest Hotel, and it is evident in the projection or the exhibition of the film at the theater, you can see how he changed aspect ratios um, in his images. Sometimes the images are filling the screen, sometimes they're letterboxed either vertically or horizontally. And that's because he chose to use different formats at different times as a tribute, sort of an unspoken tribute to the history of the cinema. And so he used the three principal aspect ratios that I have pictured here. 133, or more specifically 137, is the what we call the original Academy aperture, the Academy proportion for cinema projection, and the camera is captured in the same format, which was I think it's 4:3 derives 133 to 1 aspect ratio. It's almost a square presentation screen. Okay, and ironically, in the 50s when television became prevalent, television copied the same Academy aperture more or less and gave us the 133 aspect ratio on the screens that we enjoyed viewing at home. And part of the reason why was because in the early days of cinema, that was the standard proportion of any screen that you would see in the theater was 137 to 1, the dimensions. And so television in the 50s was competing with the theatrical experience, trying to draw folks out of the theaters and keep them home and in the privacy of their own living rooms by getting them to run out and buy television sets so that they could watch content at home without having to go downtown, park the car, buy refreshments, go into the theater, sit for a movie, and then reverse the process to get home. The idea was to make it attractive for people to watch content without having to leave the comfort of their own home. So the television was trying to mimic the aspect ratio of the theater. In response to that, the theater created a new rectangle to watch, the 185 rectangle. Okay. And so films that were projected in the theater were projected in 185, which is the cinema aspect ratio, 185 to 1. And that is more or less, after the changeover, been the prevailing aspect ratio ever since, 185 to 1. However, as TV started to gain popularity at home and they were drawing people away from the theaters and people were staying home and watch TV, 185 wasn't pulling them out of the house to go downtown and deal with all of the logistics of going to the theater. So they came up with the CinemaScope or the UltraVision concept, the anamorphic ultra panavision process, which offered us a 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio, or a really wide, narrow rectangle that gave us almost a panoramic feel. So movies that were shot outside and offered long outdoor vistas, like Lawrence of Arabia, stuff like that. Those types of images fit really nicely in this really wide, narrow aspect ratio, and it drew people in as a spectacle. So it was really kind of a gimmick that ended up sort of lingering longer than I think anyone anticipated, because it's an interesting format to view a movie in. And I think you'll agree, in cases like movies like Star Wars, for instance, where you have spaceships flying through these beautiful star fields over the planet Yavin or whatever they're doing, and everything is in that long narrow rectangle. It just seems right. The spatial relationship and the arrangement of elements in the frame compositionally feels really, really nice. Whereas it might feel a little awkward in a square like 133 watching it on TV. That's what we had to do, though, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, before HD was adopted as the new television standard. One of the things that we did when we went from the old standard definition television broadcast, which was 680 lines by 480 lines, or pixel by pixel, 680 by 640 by 480. When we jumped up to 1920 by 1080, they changed the screen format standard from 133 to 16 by 9, which is now the current rectangle that you watch television on at your house. So HD, not only did HD nearly quadruple the resolution of standard definition, but we changed the presentation standard from a short blocky square to a wider rectangle, which made, I think, for a more pleasing presentation. The rectangle on your television set at 16 by 9 is only marginally narrower lengthwise than the Cinema 185, which is a 17 by 9 ratio. So now at home, you're seeing almost the same presentation rectangle that you can watch in the theater. It's 17 by 9 in the theater, 185 to 1, and 16 by 9 at home. Okay. Which is something like 178 to 1, I believe it is. Very, very close in the dimensions. So you're either watching at the theaters nowadays 185, or you're seeing the digital version of Ultravision, which is 239 to 1. 235 to 1 is the film equivalent. 239 is the digital equivalent, because 235 included an audio track, an optical audio track on the film stock. So it took up a little bit of the available image room on the film projected in the theater. So it's 235 on film, 239 in digital, or 240. Okay, but you can get that nice wide anamorphic or ultravision look with digital cameras now just as effectively. It's all about the presentation medium. So it's all about the screen that you're going to view the images on, right? What's the venue? We always ask, where is this content going to be consumed? Is it going to be shown on television? Is it going to be shown on the web? Is it going to be shown in a theater, right? Now, the screen relationship is more or less the same. The theater is 185, your television 16 by 9, which is 178 to 1. And if you've got a 15 or 16-inch MacBook Pro, for instance, you're looking at the same basics aspect ratio on your computer screen. It's actually a little taller, slightly, because there's a few more pixels available on the Retina displays. But it's more or less, 16 by 9 content will fit comfortably on your laptop screen now as well. So you'll notice that computer monitors now are all coming out in 16 by 9. They're not coming out in these odd squares anymore, these 4:3 or 133 squares. They're coming out accommodating the HD standard. So it was kind of nice, the things that happened in 2005 when we switched broadcast standards. But each one of these screens reflects a different way of looking at your images. So you've got the ultra wide screens, like those curved computer screens you can look at home, or an IMAX screen at the theater, for instance. Um, they're all offering full frame, wide format, anamorphic or ultravision style framing. Your 16 by 9 TV can give you the same framing if they letterbox it top and bottom. And so can a 4:3 for that matter. It's just that the letterbox bars are even wider and maybe a little distracting. And as a result, the images are all kind of a little shrunk as well. So, it's not ideal to watch the Ultravision standard on a 4:3 133 television because you'll have all this wasted space in the image area. Okay. So you can shoot any of these standards in most of the professional digital cinema cameras and many of the prosumer cinema cameras. So an important question to ask your producers, maybe your director, if you're shooting the film, is where the content is going to be viewed. If it's going to be viewed, on the web, you can choose virtually any aspect ratio you want, because we're free to make those viewing windows whatever size and shape we want. If you're going to watch it on television, it should fit in 16 by 9 and probably full screen, full image area. And then in the theater, you got your choices. 185:1, which we call DCI, if it's 4K, DCI 4K, which is digital cinema interface, right? It's a DCP is a digital cinema um, projection, right? It uses 4096 by 2160 pixel area, and then projects that on a screen that is slightly wider than the screen at home, 185:1 aspect ratio. Okay. Or you can shoot the ultra wide 239. So in Grand Budapest Hotel, how many of you have seen it?
Yeah.
I see one thumbs up and I hear one person. I don't have all my thumbnails open, so I can't tell who's saying what. Well, if you check it out, it might be worth checking it out again just to see what I'm talking about. But in several different places in the movie, the framing of the aspect ratio changes from 185 to 235 to 137. And I've given you a few specific instances here. Here's a scene towards the end where Agatha and Zero are rescuing Mr. Gustav. Here's Mr. Gustav in prison, and you can see how the framing is making use of the entire corner to corner image area, and it's constructing the image following certain rules. In this case, we see demonstrated the convergence compositional rule, where lines of convergence that head towards the horizon are all leading our eye right to a central element, which is our focal point, which is Mr. Gustav. In this scene, however, though, where they're in the elevator, this is where Mr. Gustav is escorting Madame D to her chauffeured ride, the limousine. She's leaving the hotel. Her vacation's over, and he switches the aspect ratio. He's in this small elevator, and so he figures I can get more image area top to bottom, and it can be maybe funnier the way we can arrange these people in these tight confines if I'm in the 137 image area instead of the 185 image area, for instance, or worse, instead, rather than being in the 239 image area where we have here Zero's close up when he's talking to the reporter, telling the reporter his life story, how he acquired the hotel. This is F. Murray Abraham, and this is his close up as Zero as an old man. And they're using the 235 aspect ratio, which is the widest rectangle, to take advantage of some of the details of the set. For instance, all these doors, you see how that's a repeating detail in the background, and they're all kind of acting as a repetitive pattern. You can also see a little bit of the pin cushioning because of that wide angle lens that they use to shoot this shot with. But that crown molding is actually bending corner to corner. That's pretty wild. I've got another raking angle showing you the two shot using the same aspect ratio, the 235 aspect ratio. And he's showing you the backdrop inside the dining room of the hotel and how lavish it is, and the fact that it has a live entertainment venue in the background and all the tables and everything. And then these two guys are just sitting in a pool of light subtly in the center of the whole place because it's, I guess, off season or something like that. And Zero has come back to take possession of the hotel after being away for many years, and he's telling his life story to this reporter. So at different times in the film, and it happens very subtly, you may be watching and not even realize that the aspect ratio has changed and there's letterboxing on the screen where there wasn't any in the previous scene. So it might be worth checking out. I think it's kind of a clever little thing. He said in an interview he did it to pay tribute to the history of cinema and the different time periods of cinema. So 137 aspect ratio is the oldest aspect ratio where the cinema began over 100 years ago. The 185 is the traditional contemporary theatrical aspect ratio, and then the widescreen that is reminiscent of the heyday of like Technicolor films and Ultravision films, where in the 50s, where they were drawing folks in back into the theaters from home to look at a new spectacle, a really, really wide projection screen. So that's the projection, that's the presentation aspect of what we're doing. And sometimes it has to do with the way our cameras record the images, and it all starts with the sensor. This is a CMOS imager. Inside, I think this is a this looks like it might be it's not a GH5, and it's not a pocket cinema camera. Can't quite be sure what this actual camera is here, but that's what we call a micro four thirds image sensor. So it's roughly, I think, 19.3 millimeters by something like 17.9. Okay, it's almost the 4:3 aspect ratio or the 1:37 aspect ratio. And there's some very interesting things that the Panasonic GH5, for instance, which uses the same sensor, can do with an imager that's these pixel dimensions. But sensors will come in lots of different shapes and sizes. The majority of them now, the industry has kind of settled down and gone for a standard that is proportional to 16:9, because that's the broadcast standard. So if you're producing a camera that shoots ultra HD, which is broadcast 4K, in other words, 3,840 pixels by 2,160 pixels, your imager is probably going to have at least an active area that is in the same 16:9 proportion as your television set. Okay, so we call that the native aspect ratio. Here are the different proportions listed with their presentation aspect ratios to boot. So the 3:2 ratio is equivalent to a 1.5 to 1 aspect ratio, or simply 1.5. 4:3 is equivalent to the 1:33 or 1:37 Academy legacy aspect ratio. We simply call that 1:33 or TV aspect ratio, and that's the old TV standard. 16:9 is the new TV standard at 178:1, proportionately speaking. The aspect ratio we just simply refer to as 178. Cinema projection 185:1, 16:9 proportion. And then 21:9 is the 233, 235 film or 239 digital widescreen proportion. Here's one of those films. This is Wolf Crow. Check it out. It's a 6 or 8 minute video about sensors and how different sensors can affect your images in terms of light gathering capability. I don't want to linger on it here because I don't want to get too deep in the weeds. I want to get through with this presentation in less time than yesterday. But I want you to think about what's going on inside your camera when you start thinking about the images that you're going to create, the hard drives you're going to need to store your footage, the linear editing systems you're going to need to handle the original content, and the media that you're going to shoot on to accommodate the size of the files that are going to be generated by the type of sensor you're using in your camera. Okay, so all of this stuff sort of ties together, and hopefully I can make it clear to you why. So over here, we have presumably a Canon 60D, or maybe it's an EOS 7D with an APS-C size sensor. And you can see that that's very nearly a 16:9 aspect ratio or proportion. And this looks like a 5D, and it has what we call a full frame sensor in it, which has a dimension of roughly 24 by 36 millimeters. It's pretty big. So 25 millimeters is more or less an inch high by 36 millimeters wide. Okay, which is, if you divide 24 by 36, what do you get? Let's see here, 24 divided by 36. Yeah, it's 1.6 times wider than it is high. It's pretty big imager. They're coming out with bigger imagers now, but this is the full frame is still considered an excellent imager if you want to shoot images at night, because the photo sites that are on these two these two capture devices, if they both have the same native resolution, say Ultra HD, 3840 by 2160, but one is notably bigger than the other, like almost twice as big as this one, that means that the photo sites, and I'm going to explain what those are in a minute, the photo sites on this image sensor are bigger than the photo sites on this image sensor. It doesn't have anything to do with the resolution because they both have the same native resolution, but bigger photo sites means that this sensor might be able to see more clearly in low light and give you a little bit better clean and not noisy image in lower light intervals than this sensor. Okay. Here is a representation of basically what the different image sensor sizes see in a standard frame. If this were, for instance, a 50mm lens on a full frame camera, you would see the entire corner to corner contents of this outside orange triangle. And then if you can think of a lens as a projection system, okay, so you've got a front element and you've got a rear element, and then light passes through. It's controlled by the iris, and the iris can be bigger or smaller to let more or less light through the lens at one time. And so the image and all that light that make the image come in the front element, and they're projected out the back element onto the image sensor. Okay. And sometimes the projection that comes out the back of the lens is exactly what's needed to cover the image sensor. And sometimes it's more than what's needed to cover the image sensor. If it's more than what the sensor requires, the image will appear to have a magnified look to it, because what you're really doing is only seeing a portion of the overall image, and it's being captured right through the center of the image circle that's projected onto the sensor. That's why all these squares are converging towards the middle of this frame. As the sensor gets smaller, it's using less and less of the projected image circle coming out the back of that lens, right? So the full frame sensor takes the entire image circle coming out of the back of your 50mm lens. But the APS-C that's in your 7D is only seeing this next inner angle here, or this inner rectangle here, this one, okay? And it's using less of the overall image circle. So it's only seeing what's happening in the center of the image within this proportion. And then we keep going down the scale. The micro four thirds sensor is even smaller. So it's seeing even less, roughly 1/2 of what, or 1/4, I'm sorry, of what the 5D is seeing. Okay. And it's punched, we call it center punched, right out of the middle of the image. Okay. So a 50mm lens on a Canon 5D with a 24 by 36mm sensor gives you this entire image of this young lady in a 2-button close-up. And the same 50mm lens on a Panasonic GH5 with a micro four thirds inch sensor gives you a magnified look, which resembles something more like a 100mm lens perspective than a 50mm lens. So what that tells you is, if you're going to use cameras with smaller sensors than normal, you need wider lenses with a wider field of view to get the same kind of image proportion that you get from a larger sensor with a stronger lens. Okay, that's the relationship. So it'll become more apparent. We're going to talk about lenses week after next. I'll talk about this concept some more, and we're going to talk about cameras next week. So we're going to keep having this conversation, but just suffice it to say that smaller capture devices see less of the overall image circle and therefore need wider lenses to maintain the same fields of view that cameras with larger sensors can see. Whatever we're talking about here, what we're really doing is we're trying to mimic what we used to be able to do with film stock and film cameras. So the entire digital generation has pretty much been an exercise in redundancy, in trying to recreate all of the advantages and quality of the era of film, but without the photochemical process. So we don't use film stock anymore that has to be developed by special labs. We don't have, the projection equipment is not quite the same. It's all digital now. We don't need We don't need a physical medium to project the images anymore. We can project from a file through an image server that creates the projected image electronically, as opposed to analog with projection globes and motors and spindles and all the stuff we needed for film projection. So our primary concern with digital for the last 8 years has been to match the quality and then supplant the technology from analog to digital and move forward as a full digital process. We're only 8 years into that process, folks. 8 years ago, maybe 9 by now, we were still shooting all the major motion pictures that you saw in the theater. We were still shooting them all on film. Okay, so the last major feature that I did was in 2008. That was Angels and Demons. We shot all that on film. Okay.
And how do they get CGI back on those tapes?
What we were doing is a complicated process of film to digital projection, basically. We would take the film stock after it's been shot and developed and then turned into a positive or a work print. They would then project that onto a sensor, okay, part of a scanning device, and that scanner would digitally process the projected image into a digital image, very similar to the way your sensor in your camera is working now, very similar to this process. Okay. And so we would use like ARRI Northlight scanners to scan the film stock and the movie on film onto the Northlight scanner, and it would convert it to digital. That was called a digital intermediate. Okay. So we'd have the best of all possible worlds in the sense that the masters on film had an sort of they had a tangible existence, right? It was a roll of film, and as long as you stored it at around 52 degrees in a room with little to no light, the archival life expectancy of a motion picture uh, stored on film stock was almost 100 years, fully 75 years without any shifting colors or any degradation of the image, right? No IR pollution of the image. Whereas digital files now last on hard drives technically for only about 10 years. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to keep resaving the files on newer hard drives with newer spindle platters or with solid state recording capability to keep refreshing the image file to keep the data whole, right? If you were to put your digital feature film on a hard drive and throw it in a closet and go back to it 20 years later, you might find that all the files are corrupted because what you have is a latent system requiring, you know, micro measures of electricity to keep electron gates open or closed, and plus or minus is data, right? So an image in its most rudimentary form is pluses and minuses, ones and zeros, and those are all controlled mechanically by switches that are energized. Over time, those switches lose their latent power, and therefore the files become corrupted and you can't play them back. That's why you're supposed to put the images on newer hard drives they recommend every 5 years. But I think I've got hard drives that are 10 years old and I can still access files on them 98% of the time. So I'm thinking that it might be longer than 5 years, but certainly no more than 10. Does that make sense? Here at UCF, we have a number of different camera platforms that you guys are going to be able to access and borrow for your film projects. I have some of them featured here and some other cameras that you guys don't have yet here at school. But the idea was to show you a comparative survey of all the different image sensors that are in these different cameras. So the Canon 5D, which you guys have at UCF, has what we call a full frame sensor in it. Similar to the sensor in the Sony A7 series. So the A7 II, the A7 III, and the A7. Okay. Those cameras are all full frame sensors, and they'll shoot 24 by 36 millimeter image files and generate some pretty big raw data. We also have Blackmagic cameras at school. This is the Ursa Mini. It has what we call a Super 35 sensor. So it's something in between the APS-C that was in the Canon 7D that I showed you in this image here. This is APS-C. You can see how it's kind of a stubby rectangle. And then the sensor inside the Ursa Mini is a little bit longer. That's because this is a DCI aspect ratio. It's a 4096 by 2160 aspect ratio, Super 35. Same with the Canon C100 over here. It's got a Super 35 DCI 4K image area. This is the the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. This one has a this one has a 4/3 sensor, a little bit bigger than the Micro Four Thirds. The difference is a difference in flange depth. In other words, the back of the lens is seated a little bit closer to the sensor in Micro Four Thirds than it is. I'm sorry, a little bit further away in Micro Four Thirds than it is in a 4/3 sensor. So the lenses project actually perfectly onto the M4 sensor, and give you a pretty interesting and comparable image, even in high resolutions, to some of the Super 35 sensors, as long as you use lenses in the wider end of the focal length spectrum. So like a standard lens on this camera would be 25 millimeters. On the Canon 5D, it would be 50 millimeters. Okay, so your lens selection for this camera might be 12, 25, 35, 50. And then if you double each of those values, you get 24, 50, 70 millimeter, and 100 millimeter. Okay, which is what the focal lengths would be on a Canon 5D for the same 4 or 5 lenses. Okay, so the image sensor is going to dictate the focal length of lenses that you use. As long as you match them appropriately, the images will have the same perspectives, and you'll never be able to tell which sensor you shot them on. Okay. Here's the 7D. There's that APS-C sensor. Micro Four Thirds also in the Panasonic GH5. So the Pocket 4K and the Panasonic GH5 both have Micro Four Thirds. 7D has APS-C. And then the old Pocket camera, which you guys have a number of at UCF, has a Micro Four Thirds sensor, which only uses 2/3 of the total image area. And this is a specialized sensor. And the idea here was, and you can see how the light green area, that's the active area on the sensor. You see how it looks like a DCI rectangle? It's kind of longer and skinnier than the regular APS-C. This is designed to give you a look digitally that compares to 16 millimeter film stock. These cameras have a very interesting image quality that I think is fairly unique. And you guys have a number of them here to play with at school. So I would highly recommend checking these out. The problem that you have with a little pocket camera, unfortunately, because the sensor is so small, is a 50 millimeter lens on this camera is equivalent to a 150 millimeter lens on a Canon 5D. It's almost 3 times reproduction ratio because of the small sensor. Okay, so you're going to have a real narrow choice for lenses on the Pocket, the original Pocket cinema camera that only shoots HD because of the size of the sensor. And then for comparison's sake, here is the kind of thing you'd find inside your cell phone. It's a very small 1/3 inch CMOS sensor that your cell phone camera is using. Okay, so really small image sensor. Okay. What I want you to take away from this, and what I want you to think about, is that the sensor is really just a huge group of pixels in the millions in terms of the number of imagers on that little diode. Okay, the number of pixels is referring to the resolution of your image sensor, and then the pixel count comes in the same kind of ratio as your projected image or your screen, right? So it's length by width, proportionately speaking. Standard definition is the old broadcast standard, like I said, 640 by 480 pixels per inch. And then ultra high definition is 3840 by 2160. And the current television standard high definition is 1920 by 1080. Okay, 1920 by 1080 is almost 4 times the broadcast standard, and the 4K broadcast capability of a lot of these professional cameras is 4 times the size of HD in terms of the file size and the comparable image area. So 4K is a pretty massive file, speaking in terms of data, and also in terms of the line resolution of the files. It's 4 times as much resolution as HD. Digital capture devices are either CCD or CMOS sensors. CCD sensors were the standard for broadcast television cameras because they were 1/2 inch or 1/3 inch CCDs. There'd be 3 of them. Each chip was tuned to red, blue, or green, which are the projection primaries for film and video. And a CMOS sensor, there's only 1 sensor in a digital video camera now instead of 3 in the days of CCD. We have 1 CMOS sensor. And the reason we changed technologies is because the CMOS sensors are a little bit better in terms of power consumption. So you don't kill your batteries as quickly with a CMOS sensor, and they don't get as hot. So they tend not to overheat as quickly as CCDs would. So we've improved the technology in the last 10 years in terms of digital imagers when we switched from CCD to CMOS. Okay. Picture elements, or pixels for short, are simply a physical representation of data, either 1 or 0. And if you have, how many pixels are in a bit? I believe there's 8 pixels in a bit. Okay, and there happens to be, pardon?
If it's 8-bit, there's usually 8 pixels, but there's 16 and it's 16-bit.
Right. I'm going to talk about 8-bit for now because that's the broadcast standard. And understand that, this is, so I'm talking about like what you'd use for TV, for television recording. Okay, so 8 pixels per bit and 8 bits per byte in terms of data. And that's going to be important in a few minutes when we talk about how much video we can record on our media cards. Okay. Photo sites are divided into pixels. Pixels are tuned to either red, blue, or green, and they're arranged in an interesting array. If you were to look at your sensor under a magnifying glass, you'd see what we call a Bayer pattern, a Bayer pixel pattern, where each one of the pixels is sensitive to one of the 3 primary colors. And notice that there's more green pixels than there are red or blue pixels. More green pixels gives the image a brighter, more contrasty appearance. And it's the first color, I guess, that the eye can differentiate between easier, I guess, than between red and blue. I guess that's the theory. But anyway, in this kind of array, in this demonstration, we have 8 pixels surrounding one common aggregate pixel, which creates an aggregate adjusted color based on the data, the combined data from these 8 pixels surrounding it. Okay. In your CMOS sensors, currently, I think it uses a 6 pixel array, which is how we determine our color sampling standards between the different cameras. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a minute. Just understand that your image sensor has pixels arranged into imagers, okay, which are arranged on the surface of the sensor. Some of the pixels are red sensitive, some are blue sensitive, and some are green sensitive. And it's a combination of the data values from those pixels that are used to calculate your colors. In a broadcast system with 8-bit color, we have 256 possible colors on each color channel, red, blue, and green, for a total of, I think it's 16,000 possible colors. If you look at your pixels on your image sensor at the microscopic level, you'll see that each of these sensors has like a a dye sensitive layer. It has the actual imager, and then it has a lens over the top that focuses the light and maximizes the sensor to exposure to that light. And then it's calculated red, blue, or green through a filter, a microscopic filter. Okay. If you think about it in this way, what we're doing is we're using the 3 primary color sensitive channels to create all the visible colors that we see, that our eye sees in the spectrum. The more bits you're dealing with, the more data you're dealing with, the more color you have to work with. And the more different colors you have, the more gradations of tonality you can have in your images. And eventually it starts to have an effect on the quality and resolution of your images as well, or the apparent resolution. Okay. In the broadcast standard, which is the 8-bit color space, these are all the possible colors represented. It's kind of like a Pantone chart. And you can see we have 0 to 255, so a total of 256 colors if we consider grays and blacks to be colors. Normally, we would refer to those as shades because they don't have hue, they only have contrast and density. But in the case of calculating possible color combinations, we can use degrees of black and degrees of white or gray to create differences in hue and saturation. So in this context, we include black, white, and gray in the color space, and we get 0 absolute black to 255. Okay. When we're talking about the quality of color rendering that our cameras are capable of, we're talking about the color depth or the color science of that brand, let's say. For instance, Sony by brand has different color science than Panasonic. Panasonic's point of view of how to render these hues is slightly different in certain aspects than Sony, and it tends to be different in the context of red values, red hues. Panasonic and Sony disagree about the accuracy of red values, and so their chips reflect that. If you take video or pictures with a Sony camera, you might see that overall flesh tones might look a little redder with the Sony camera, or pinker maybe, than flesh values generated out of a Panasonic camera, where those flesh values might appear a little more yellow or a little less pink. We call that green, even though I don't really perceive it as green. I just perceive it as less pink than Sony. Okay, because their flesh tonality interpretation with the Panasonic color formula is different than the Sony color formula. Okay, and that's evident in the processors that they put in the cameras. Okay, and it's a digital calculation, remember, based on the data acquired by your bare image sensor with combinations of red, blue, and green data. Okay, so if you could look at the difference between 8-bit, which is the broadcast standard, 10-bit, or 12-bit, you can see where the color combinations start really getting racked up. In broadcast standard, 256 times red, green, and blue is 16 million colors. 10-bit means you have 1,024 color combinations on red, green, and blue for, what's that, over 1 billion. And then for 12-bit, it's over 68 billion possible colors. How does this manifest? Have you ever shot video or seen video on TV of a scene taken outdoors with a lot of blue sky in the image, and you see kind of a banding artifact in the blue sky? Okay, that's because 8-bit color in the broadcast spectrum is missing some of the natural values or densities that would be present in nature that your human eye can interpret and see very clearly as a nice even gradient. But if you've only got, your eye can see over 68 billion colors, but if you've only got 16 million to choose from, that means the camera is actually, in essence, not seeing the majority of the color values of blue in that sky. And so the result is a banded artifact where the gradation is too sensitive for the camera to interpret as different values. starts picking the wrong color values, in other words. This will come into play when the marketing campaigns of different brands are starting to brag about the accuracy of their colors or their image sensors, right? Some will say, oh, you can record 8-bit color science internally to your data cards using 10-bit ProRes 422. That would tell you that you have about 1 billion possible color combinations that you can record directly to your media card in the camera. Some cameras say you can only get this kind of color accuracy if you send the signal out of the camera by HDMI or SDI cable to an external recorder monitor like an Atomos. And then the Atomos can record the full 10-bit or 12-bit color science of what the camera is rendering, but the camera can't do it to the card because it's too much data to write to the card. Okay, so some cameras can do this kind of stuff internally. Blackmagic can do this internally. Alexa can do this internally, and I think most of the Reds can do this internally. A lot of the Sonys can't do this internally. The Panasonic GH5 can do this internally to the data card without requiring an external recorder. So it all depends on what your manufacturer is offering in terms of flexibility. They can all do the broadcast standard though, which is 8-bit. Okay. This video, which you can check out on web courses, will explain color space a little bit more. So check it out at your leisure after the show. Okay. This is the part where we start talking about your recording media. So here's an average data card. So this is a SanDisk Extreme SD card, okay? SD standing for Secure Digital, okay? And we're gonna start investigating what all these different values and labels and icons mean on this data card. So you can interpret what a data card's specs and capabilities are just by looking at the label, okay? But understand that contemporary cameras can use any number of different kind of media for image acquisition, okay? They might use SD or micro SD. I didn't put a micro SD card up here because it's basically the same image standard and specs as your full-size SD, but it's smaller physically to fit in smaller devices like your phone or some of these tiny quadcopters that are out there that take micro cards. Some of these small electronic devices that shoot video, the SD card would physically be too big. So there's a micro card size standard with the same specs as its full-size SD brother, and they just use an adapter, a card adapter to to be loaded into your laptop so you can transfer your data. But here's a standard SD card. This is the latest version of the technology referred to as compact flash. So this was flash media storage and a compact card. And we first started seeing this media standard in the Canon EOS cameras way back in as early as the 90s using compact flash. But compact flash had a data transmission speed limit, okay, which was, gosh, I'm forgetting now. It was under 300 megabytes per second, I believe. Compact flash is much faster than that now. And it translates in this way. If you're shooting high resolution 4K images, you're transferring data at rates as high as 1.5 gigabytes per second. Okay, so if you have a card that can only write at 300 megabytes per second, there's no way that data card's going to work in that camera. So you need a card with a faster read-write standard, and compact flash was the response to that. It's the next generation of, or CFast rather, it's the next generation of compact flash technology. So you have SD, XC, which is extended capacity, CFast, which is the Gen 2 compact flash, And now we've got cameras that'll just plain old spit the data out to a hard drive. And this is the Samsung solid state T5 drive, which is, I think, a half a 500 gigs or something like, comes 500 gigs or a terabyte right now in terms of storage. So if you are shooting an interview and you're shooting it in 4K and the camera is, you hit record and you sit there and let the camera run for 3 hours while you ask somebody questions, you're going to fill up these two data standards pretty quickly, almost, very, very quickly. And rather than stop the camera, stop recording, and stop the interview from taking place so you can reload with a new fresh card, you might want to go straight to a hard drive and then just let the camera run all day. Okay, provided that it won't overheat, you can let the camera run for hours recording to a hard drive. Okay. So as I said, SD stands for Secure Digital. SDHC, which used to be the video standard for media cards, is no longer because the write speeds aren't fast enough. We've now switched to Secure Digital Extended Capacity, which is XC designation. And so the write speeds on those cards are much, much faster. Okay. SDHC also has a file limitation of, I think it's 400 megabytes. So if a data file is bigger than 400 megabytes, it starts breaking up the data file into chunks that have to be reassembled when those files are transferred from the media card into your laptop, for instance, so you can edit. Okay, which means you have to keep track of what we call stitch files, which are little proprietary function files in the metadata, which go in and find all the different parts of a particular video clip and reassemble those parts in the computer when you've imported a file into, for instance, Final Cut. It's kind of a pain. So we don't use SDHC cards for that reason anymore. We use cards with a different recording standard and a higher digital capacity, and we've alleviated that problem. Okay. Other forms of digital recording media, compact flash, which is now CFast, SSDs in the hard drive category. All right. Extreme Pro, SanDisk is the brand. Extreme Pro is the model of this particular data card. We're going to take a look at, okay, we got the brand name, we got the model. We're going to take a look at the type of card, SDXC, interface class 1, video class 30, UHC class 3, speed class 10 with a capacity of 128 gigabytes. What does that all mean? Okay, we're going to look at all these values on the label of this data card, and I want to talk to you briefly about the classes. The classes are designated by two factors, read speed and write speed. So on this card, we have some information right here, right below the model of the card. We have 95 megabytes per second. Capital M, capital B / S, megabytes per second, 95. This is how quickly a device like your computer can read the data off this card. It can read it at 95 megabytes per second. Okay. SDXC is the style of the card, the formatting of the card. V30 is a speed standard, and it's a video speed standard. That's what stands for, video. Okay. Normally, cards came in speed classes of 2 to 10, 2 through 10. And with each generation of SD improvements, we changed the class from 2 to 4 to 8 to 10. Okay. And 10 meant you had a minimum read write speed on that card of 10 megabytes per second. That was your minimum standard for reading and writing. Okay. But what we found was 10 megabytes per second, in light of the new 4K specs that were coming out with these cameras, wasn't going to be a fast enough data transfer rate for the camera writing to the card, writing data from the image sensor to the card. Okay. It had to be faster than 10 megabytes per second, because a lot of these cameras now record 4K at a minimum of 100 or 150 megabits per second. Megabits per second. Uh-oh. Megabytes per second was the speed rating for the cards, but the cameras are talking about megabits per second. So now we got to go back to our understanding of data and how it's wrangled, right? Bits versus bytes. A bit is a binary digit. It's the smallest unit, 1 or a 0. 8 of those consists of a byte, okay? 1 byte of data is 8 bits. So if we go back and look at this card and we see that it's 95 megabytes per second read speed and V30 is 30 megabytes per second write speed. Speed class 10 being only 10 megabytes per second. If you multiply that times 8, you get 80 megabits per second. 80 megabits per second was plenty for HD cameras when digital HD became our video standard. But the minute everybody started talking about 4K and that 4K needed at least 100 megabits per second, speed class 10 was no longer a viable data card. We needed something faster. So that's when they came up with the video standard, and they came up with the V30, V60, and V90 cards, but they had to update the UHS speed from class 1 to class 3. Okay, so now if you look on your cards, if you want to shoot 4K video, you need to make sure you get at least a UHS 3 and V30 if you want to shoot 4K with any kind of beefy data rate at all. If you want to shoot 4K at 100 megabits per second, you can't take just a regular old class 10 card. You got to have a V30 card so you can get over that 80 megabits threshold. Does that make sense to everybody? Sort of, maybe, possibly. Okay. It's just numbers right now. And just kind of let it go in. Just let it sink in and think about it. You can re-examine the PDFs that I've provided for you to get this all again, this explanation again. But I wanted to show you that these things actually mean something, and they all translate into your camera's capabilities and the kinds of recordings you can make with your camera, okay? So V30, video class 30 card, 30 megabytes per second is actually 30 times 8, which is what?
24.
24 or 240?
240.
240 megabits per second.
I was thinking three times 8, my bad.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, if you do the simple way and then add a 0, right. Yeah, that's the idea. 240 megabits per second, right? So let's talk about the GH5 for a second. The GH5 will record 4K. Before the upgrade, it was 100 megabits per second. I think with the current updates, it's 150 megabits per second. That's your lowest quality 4K file in a Panasonic GH5. Okay. In other words, it's trading data from the camera to the card at, in 4K, 150 megabits per second. Okay. That's what we call bit rate. Okay. Or bit speed. How fast does the camera translate data to the card? 150 megabits per second. Okay. So you're going to need at least a V30 card because this will do 240. So you could do 150 megabits per second. There's also a 200 megabits per second 4K resolution standard in the GH5. So you could shoot the next highest quality, right? Medium quality 4K, 200 megabits per second using a V30 card. Okay. However, if you want to shoot 4K at maximum bit rate and 60 frames per second, that data rate for the GH5 camera is 400 megabits per second. 400 megabits per second. So what does that tell you about your video standard if you're going to shoot 60 frames in 4K on a GH5? Is 240 bigger than 400?
I'm gonna go with no.
No?
So you need a faster video standard yet again. The next highest is the V60 standard, 60 megabytes per second data rate, data transfer rate, write speed, in other words, 60 times 8, 480 megabits per second.
Which means 90 would be at 810.
Yeah, baby. That's fast. That's smoking fast, right?
Yeah.
So there are some cameras that are coming out now. The newer lines of cameras are writing at these enormously fast speeds. Why are they doing that? For a few reasons. But let's think about it. Okay. If you have a camera that is shooting 4K Ultra HD at 400 megabits per second, and you've got a 4K camera right next to it recording the same 4K resolution, but it's only recording at 100 megabits per second. You can make some logical assumptions about the images between these two cameras based on one very simple truth between the two standards. One camera is recording 4 times as much data as the other camera. So wouldn't logic dictate that the camera shooting 4K images at 400 megabits per second might have either better detail, better contrast, or better color, or all three, because it's 4 times as much data for that processor to interpret into an image than the competitor at 4K 100 megabits per second? What do you think? What if we think about it this way? What if we think about it as you have a garden at home with vegetables and you need to water the garden, and you're going to water the garden for 10 minutes with a garden hose. And the garden hose is about as big around as your thumb, right? Maybe an inch in diameter. So you turn on the garden hose and you water the ground for 10 minutes. And you have X amount of water on the ground from your garden hose. And then you realize, man, this is taking forever. So you get out a fire hose, which is like 2 inches around, which is 4 times bigger than your garden hose, and you turn it on for the same 10 minutes. When you look at the ground is 4 times more saturated with water using the fire hose than it is using the garden hose. So 100 megabits per second is like using a garden hose, and 400 megabits per second is like using a fire hose. Okay. It's how much data are you allowing to pass from the camera processor to the card in an X interval of time, whatever X equals, a second, a minute. Okay. How much data is going to pass through at one time based on the speed of the processor and the ability of the card to write that data to the card. Okay. That's what's happening inside your camera. Okay. And that's really kind of the nugget that I want you to focus on here, more so than the specific numbers and stuff, because all of that will come with, repetition and time and practice. Okay. Just understand that 4K, you want to have a video standard speed card, at least V30, preferably V60. Okay. UHS class 3, which is the current speed class for UHS for SD cards. And it obviously by default will be class 10, because it can't be UHS 3 and V30 without also being class 10. So that's actually kind of a redundant piece of information now. Although sometimes you can get lucky and you can go to like Walgreens and you'll find a UHS 3 class 10 card on the shelf. But understand that if you're shooting HD on like a Sony FS5, which records HD at 68 megabits per second, yeah, you could use this SD card in that camera for that application. But the minute you switch the camera over to 4K, the camera would tell you this card is not qualified to shoot 4K in that camera because it's only a class 10 card. You'll get some
So
warning on the viewfinder.
Which class of card would be able to use 4K Ultra just fine?
I use Lexar Media V60 cards, speed class V60, and I get them from B&H. The last time I bought them, I buy them in groups of like two or four, and I got them for two for $50 on sale. So they're usually not too terribly bad. The prices used to be a lot higher, but the prices are starting to come down because manufacturing is getting cheaper and cheaper. And we're getting better and better at this. Every year that this is going on, the prices are coming down and it's easier to make these data cards. Now, the V90s are still kind of pricey. So you're going to pay, over $100, upwards of $200 for like some of the Angel Bird V90 SD cards because they're kind of rare too. I think SanDisk is starting to come out with V90 cards. Um, I haven't seen one yet, but I think they have them already. But like I said, I get V60 cards, and SanDisk is also kind of they're at the high end of retail pricing, right? Because they have all these different, classes of card. Extreme Pro is what they consider their professional data cards. So for the equivalent card, this card might cost you maybe $60 at B&H. The equivalent card in Lexar might cost you 45 or 50. Um, and I think that they work equally well by brand. So I don't have a preference. I just buy the Lexar because they're a little bit cheaper.
So like a class 10 SD card would not. It's the
Not
it's
for
the
4K. Not for 4K. No, unfortunately.
so so basically anything up so any card class above a 10 would work. Like a class card class 11.
Well, there is no speed class 11 yet that I know of. The next speed class to come out, if they were going to keep doing this, which is a kind of an antiquated standard, would have to be like at least 12. But like I said, this is an antiquated standard. This is the preferred standard now. It specifies that you're going to be shooting video. If you're shooting stills, this doesn't really matter. And if you're shooting HD video, this mostly doesn't matter. If you got a speed class 10 and you're shooting HD, it's 80 megabits per second, and most every HD camera can accommodate that. HD is anything from 17 to 80 megabits per second, and the broadcast standard write speed for HD, I think, is only 60 megabits per second. So you're fine with class 10 with HD. It was when everybody started wanting 4K that this had to change. Okay, so 4K is the culprit here. The minute everybody wanted to shoot 4K with high bit rate, and then they wanted to shoot high frame rate to get beautiful slow motion, high frame rate drives your data consumption way up. So you have to have big cards with big holding capacity, fast write speeds, okay, 400 megabits per second or more, right, to record, say, 60 frames of 4K at full resolution. Okay, so that's what's driving the media industry crazy right now, and causing them to, raise the level of their game because of the size of the files that these cameras can generate now at such high resolution. So I would say, if you're going to buy cards today and you want them to be somewhat future proof, I would get I would get V60 speed class cards, just to make sure that, if you buy a camera next year and it records 4K 60 at, 500 megabytes per second, well, you're not quite there because this is only 480, but 400 megabits per second can certainly do. So GH5 is all good. What we're seeing now is cameras that are coming out that are now experimenting with forms of compression, which is data consumption compression or data rendering compression, which is affecting the need for V90 cards. They're coming out with like the Z cameras and stuff like that are shooting H.265 compressed high resolution files, where they can get 6K resolution out of the same data rates they were getting 4K resolution out of by using certain kind of compression algorithms to reduce the file sizes. So I'd say right now, if you buy V60, you're pretty safe which means you're going to be spending about 40, 50 bucks for a data card, but you know, you're not going to have to toss it out next year necessarily. Okay. This little video here will explain this all again to you. It's about 6 minutes long. You can watch it at your leisure, pull it down off of web courses. It's under the videos from the lecture. And you can check all that out again. So remember, bits, bytes, kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, okay? Every time you jump from one category to the next after bit to byte's only 8, factor of 8. Byte to kilobyte, kilobyte to megabyte, megabyte to gigabyte. Each time you make a jump, you got to multiply that value by a factor of 1,024. Okay. So if you want to convert megabytes to kilobytes, multiply by 1024. Gigabytes to megabytes, 1024. Gigabytes to megabits, 1024, and then by 8, and then you get megabits. Okay, and that's how we're going to determine how much recording time you have on your cards. Let me show you a little demonstration here. Okay, we're going to calculate the volume of an SD card. Okay, and I'm not talking about the gigabyte rating because we know what the maximum capacity is, but we want to turn that gigabyte value into minutes at, say, 4K resolution at a given data rate. Okay, so we're going to need to know some stuff. Find out what the bit rate of your camera is. Okay. In the manufacturer's specs, it'll tell you what the recording bit rates are. If I were to show you how easy it is to find that information, I like B&H Photo for a lot of reasons. I buy a lot of gear from B&H. If you go to the B&H website, bhphoto.com, all right, and you want to look up a camera, what camera do we want to look at? Toss something out there.
Canon EOS 80D.
80D? How about something a little bit more contemporary? How about something professional 4K oriented? How about the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera? Not the 6K though. Let's go with the 4K. All right. Let's say, because UCF is planning on buying a bunch of these, so by the time you guys get your production classes under your belt, you'll be borrowing these from the UCF lockup and shooting your school projects on them. So let's take a look at that. That's a good idea. If you pull this camera up on the B&H website and you click on the specs tab, it's going to tell you what the recording standards are for this camera. Internal recording, that means to the media you put into the camera, not what's possible by piping the data out of the camera to an external recorder. This is to the media card inside the camera, okay? In uncompressed RAW, it can shoot 4096 by 2160. That's 4K DCI. And it's doing it at anywhere from 21 to 203 megabytes per second. What's 203 times 8?
That's 0 times 0. Yeah, it's multiply the. You said it was 2. You said it was 83, right?
203 times 8.
203 times 8. So we carry the
1,624 megabits per second, folks. Okay, that's uncompressed, what we call an uncompressed raw file. So they haven't done any voodoo algorithms yet to shrink the size of the file. It's all the data coming out of that digital processor in that camera, 1,624 megabits per second. That blows a Sony FS5 out of the solar system, because the FS5 is only recording 4K at 200 megabits per second. The 4K pocket camera is the boss, okay? That's a lot of data, though. That's a lot of data. That's a raw file. We need to reduce the volume of data coming out of that processor and hitting that media card. So we use a compression algorithm, in this case, ProRes 422HQ. When we go to 422HQ, we can reduce our data flow to 117.88 megabytes per second. What's that? 117.88 times 8. 943 megabits per second. That's starting to sound doable. Let's see if we can fit it on an SD card, though. A V90 Angel Bird, 90 times 8 is only 720. Uh-oh. We need a different media standard for the pocket camera if we're going to shoot ProRes HQ422. SD card, secure digital, is going to have a limitation of a write speed of 720 megabits per second for now in 2021. The cards that'll write faster and longer are the CFast cards. So if you're going to shoot ProRes, which is the highest quality, virtually uncompressed, just mildly compressed, big resolution, not full resolution, but big resolution file, HQ, high quality, 422 color space, okay, which is 10-bit, which means a billion colors. 117.88 translates into, what did I say, 943 megabits per second, give or take. So you go to a CFast card, which will record up to, I think it's 525 megabits per second. No, I'm sorry. That's wrong. Let's look at it. Says, yeah, megabytes, 525 megabytes per second times 8. That's like over 2000 megabits per second. No problem. You can shoot ProRes HQ 422, 10-bit color space, full resolution, 4K, all day long on a CFast card. Okay, so the information is here. Just go to the camera that you like or the camera that you're going to use or rent or buy or borrow. Go to the B&H website because it's the most accessible. Go to the specs tab for that particular camera and go down to the internal recording standards and it'll tell you all of them. And okay, let's say you don't have access to any CFast cards. You don't want to buy them because they're kind of pricey, a couple $100 a piece. Okay, what's the next smallest image file? ProRes 422. It's not HQ, it's ProRes standard 422. It's still the 10-bit billion color space, which is nice, better than broadcast standard. This is film standard now, cinema standard quality. 422, full 4K resolution, 78.63 megabytes. Call it 79 megabytes per second. What's that? 79 times 8. Oh, that'll fit on a V90 card. V90 is peaking out at 720 megabits per second. This is only 632. So you got to go out and find yourself an Angel Bird SD card. Or I don't know if the SanDisk Extreme XC V90s are out yet. I think they are. Let's look. We got the B&H website open. Let's look. Let's go up here and look for SanDisk V90 SD XC. Here's V30, V30, micro V30. Let's see, brand, Angel Bird. All right, here's a V90 Angel Bird, 128 gigabytes, same size as that SanDisk I showed you in the lectures deck. V90 video write speed, minimum of 300 megabits per second. Minimum. That's the minimum write speed. Okay, but 300 times 8 is what? Like 2400 megabits per second. Okay, that's going to work just fine. $200 for 128 gigs. I think that's as small as they go right now. Oh no, here we go. V90 64, $139. That's not bad. Here's one for 99. All right, so it's about twice as much as your V60 cards. Okay, but you're getting that top speed class rating. This is a future-proof card. And look, it says UHS class 2 interface, bus interface class 2. If you take your data card out of your whatever camera you got right now and look at the back side, You see how it's got a row of brass pins? See that? On the
Yeah,
back,
yeah. Nintendo's using them on their create game cartridges too. So yeah, they're trying to go down that route.
on the back of this Angel Bird card, I don't know if they're going to show us the picture. It's got 2 rows of brass contacts, which is part of the way they're getting the V90 speed class out of it. It's got twice as many contacts that can touch the bus inside the processor and get that data out of that processor.
I was
Right?
wondering what those brass lines were.
Yeah, that's where the data is transferred to the card from the processor and the camera.
So where is it stored?
Where's what stored?
The information on the data card when it goes into the SD card after going through the brass panels.
There's solid state flash memory encapsulated inside this enclosure. This is a waterproof enclosure that's protecting the solid state recording media inside. These are just contacts to transfer the data back and forth.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So if you got 2 rows of those, you got twice as much transfer interface going on. So you can pass higher data rates. 99 bucks for an Angel Bird. That's good news because it used to be more.
Nice.
Might have to get some of those. Yeah, if you want to shoot that ProRes 422 HQ, you got to have this. You got to have this stuff. So good deal. All right. So B&H Photo website, it's not just for buying cameras anymore. It's really handy for the specs. I use it for specs all the time. I go to their website and check and see what cameras will do what speeds or whatever. And it's pretty handy. And it's usually sometimes it's a little they get a little sloppy and they don't record all of the specs from the manufacturer's information, let's say. But other than going directly to the manufacturer's website, which Blackmagic is kind of notorious for not publishing their specs. You can get their specs on the B&H website, but if you go to the Blackmagic website, they won't tell you what the right class and speed class of the cameras are. I don't know why. It's kind of weird, but so I just go straight to B&H and I get the information from them because I know it's just as reliable. Okay. So let's do this little example then. So we've got, okay, we're going to take I think the example here I give is a Sony camera. We're going to take a Sony camera with a bit rate of 100 megabits per second. We know that a V30 card will work, and we know UHS class 3 will work if it's an SD card, because the write speed is 240 megabits per second. But we're going to use a GH5 compared to that Sony with a bit rate of 400 megabits per second, and we'll need a V60 card to write to. But let's calculate how much record time we would have had with that Sony. Okay, so we calculate the capacity of an existing card based on its total file capacity. In this case, I think I'm calling for a 64 gigabyte card. Okay, so I have a 64 gigabyte SD card, UHS class 3 V30, and we want to shoot at 100 megabits per second on a Sony FS5. How much recording time do we have on that card? Now, you can go to the Sony website and they'll tell you, oh, if you're shooting 4K, it's 1 gigabyte per second in 4K. That doesn't help me. I don't know what the write speed or the data rate of the camera is. They're trying to give you a generic value to give you a ballpark idea of how much time you can put on a card. But if you need to know specifically, maybe you're buying data cards for a job and you have a budget, or you're buying them for yourself and you have a budget and you want to know how much you can get on a card for how much money, or you're going to record long interviews, so we need to know, if I want to let the camera run for 4 hours, what size card do I need, right? You can figure it out, and here's how you do it. Start by multiplying the total capacity of the card, which is 64, by 1024. That's going to get you from gigabytes to megabyte size factor. Okay. So what's 64 times 1024? Who's got the calculator?
65,536.
Really? You sure?
I got the same thing.
Okay. Oh, I know why. Because now, okay, so all we did is we went from gigabytes to megabytes.
Can you see that again? The
65,000 and what?
65,536.
Okay.
no, the equation.
Gigabytes to megabytes. That's gigabytes to megabytes. 64 times 1024 gets us from gigabytes to megabytes. Now we got to go to megabits. So we need to take that 65,000 number and multiply it by 8.
$524,288.
That's the number I was listening for. That's the final number that's going to go in the top of my formula I'm going to show you in a second. Remember that number, 524,000 and what?
288.
288. 50, 24, 288.
This is like the gold standard for film when it comes to megabits.
The gold standard. It's pretty good. 400 megabits per second, 4K. That's that's sort of becoming average speed now. Yeah. Okay. 64 gigabytes to megabytes times 8 to megabits. We got 524,288. Okay. Now we need to divide that by the product of your camera's bit rate and the number 60. And here's why. Your bit rate is megabits per second, right? But we want to know how many minutes of recording time we have on our card. So whatever our value is in seconds, we got to multiply that by 60. So our bit rate is 100, right? For the FS5 times 8 is 800, right? Divide 524, 288 by 800. What do you get?
655.36.
What?
655.36.
Is that right?
Yeah, divide it, multiply that by 100, you'll get by 800, and you'll get the what I did was I divided 524,288 by 800. And I got 600.
I have to cheat and look at my formula. I get screwed up too. I'm lousy at math. Let's look at my formula.
You and me both.
Figure it out. I know. I'm so bad. I'm so bad. Okay. The card's total capacity in minutes is equal to the TC, which is the total card capacity. That'll be 64 times 1024, which gets us from gigabytes to megabyte, times 8. And that was 524,288, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And then our camera bit rate on the Sony camera, I said, was 100 megabits per second, right?
Yeah.
Right? Was that correct? GH5, FS5, yeah, 100 megabits per second. Times 8, times 60 gets us to minutes. So, oh, it's a 100 times 60. I'm sorry. What did I do? 100 times 8. That's dumb. See, that's where I made my mistake. 100 times 60 to get to minutes. So it's 5,000. So 524,288 divided by 100 times 60, which is 6,000, correct? Now what do you get? $87.38.
I was just putting
Very
it.
good.
I'm
I was
putting the
just
formula. I'm
about to
writing the formula
unmute.
down so I don't forget it.
It's down here at the bottom of the page. It's 87.38 minutes or an hour and 27 minutes of recording time.
I was trying to
Okay.
get the formula down into my phone so it could be so I won't forget it.
Yeah, man, use the formula
Check a
because
screenshot.
whenever I think about it in my head without the formula, I always mess something up.
That's why I'm trying to write it down.
You know, an hour and 27 minutes. So let's say you were going to record an interview, and you were going to let the camera just free roll for 3 hours, right? You're doing an interview with somebody really important. You make sure you got a AC power adapter for the camera, so you're not worried about batteries. You're going to record, 100 megabits per second on an FS5 in 4K. It's not really a great bit rate for 4K, but it's for TV, which is going to be an 8-bit standard. So some of that color space and some of that resolution is going to be, transferred away when they go from Ultra HD to HD anyway. So you're okay with 100 megabits per second from the FS5 for this interview for 60 minutes. So what size card do you need if you want to let that camera roll for 3 hours on, I don't know, let's say you're interviewing Joe Biden, or you're interviewing an astronaut, or somebody who just did this amazing thing, right? So what size card do you need? Well, a 64 gigabyte card gave you almost an hour and a half, but not quite. You were 3 minutes shy. So 128 gigabyte card will give you 2 hours and 54 minutes, which is pretty darn close to 3 hours, right? Are you really going to be there for 3 hours? Or because what you'd have to do is go up to a 256 gigabyte card, and then you'd have almost 6 hours of recording time. So it tells you what size card you need to get. If you'd showed up with one 64 gigabyte card and expected that to last 3 hours without cutting the camera, it wasn't going to work. Okay. And this would really be the only way you would know that, because there's really no place on the web that you can look up that specific scenario. And what happens if you go to the rental house and you say, I want to rent the FS5 for the day, I've got this interview and I'm going to record, President Biden for 3 hours. And they say, oh, we don't have any more FS5s. We'll have to rent you a pocket cinema camera. Uh-oh. That's 117.88 megabits per second. But plug that into this formula and it'll tell you what size card you need. See how that works? Hopefully you're thinking that's the coolest thing ever, because I know when the digital cameras started showing up and we were no longer shooting film and we were shooting to memory cards, I remember ripping my hair out trying to figure out how much recording time we were going to have on a data card, and looking all over the web for, how to figure this out. No, it was all brand new. This is like 2005, 2006. And all we had were estimates, and the estimate was, oh, a 64 gigabyte card will give you about a half an hour. Well, not quite. It's like 23 minutes in 4K. So a half an hour is actually an over generous estimation of that card, right? Just so happens though that I shoot 64 gigabyte cards even today in my digital cameras, and there's one vestigial traditional reason why. Can anybody guess what that reason might be? Take a stab at it. You want me to just tell you? I'm a film brat. I was raised in the film generation. In the film generation, we had 400-foot film mags and we had 1,000-foot film magazines. At 24 frames per second, which is what we record dialogue and pictures with, 1,000 feet was right around 10 minutes of record time. And then you had to reload the camera. So since 32 gigabytes was the maximum cutoff for an SDHC card, which no longer has an appropriate speed class for video, the next size card was 64 gigabytes. 64 gigabytes became the smallest capacity SD card in the XC generation of data cards. So I went from 10 minutes per mag, and I call a data card a mag, to 20 minutes. So it's kind of twice what I'm used to, but I still know in my head, I've got a clock that goes off in my head. And I know after about 10 minutes of filming, I need to reload the camera. And I like doing that because what it does is it gives everybody a little bit of a break every 20 minutes. When the camera's reloading with a new data card, people can readjust the makeup, fix the hair, tweak a light, go out and have a cigarette. You're hotboxing it, but you could go have a cigarette if you needed one. Go to the bathroom, answer a text message or something before you had to get right back to work and refocus on what you were doing. In other words, the big data cards that record all this data to the card for hours and hours, they don't give you any breaks in between, right? And that's just not cool. So I like to have those camera reload breaks just so that everybody can sort of check themselves and get a little bit of a, you know, a brain reset every 20 minutes. And it keeps everybody kind of happy. And anybody from the film generation appreciates that because we've kind of had that built-in 10-minute break kind of instilled in us from a very young age, right? So that's why I still shoot 64 gigabyte cards. But I know like the school bought all 128s minimum. I don't even know that you'll see a 64 gigabyte card at UCF, but if you do, it's probably because they bought them a couple of years ago and tried to buy the fastest cards they could get, you know, and they got the, you know, as many cards as they could get for as little bit of money, right? It's always a budget game. But that's what it is. That's how you can determine how much record time you have on a data card based on the camera you're using. Okay. So again, that data rate translates back to capabilities of your camera. It translates back to resolution. It translates back to potential color space ramifications, right? 10-bit color space is not going to be possible at 80 megabits per second. You're going to be stuck in the 8-bit color space, in the broadcast standard color space at 16 million colors. You're not going to get that billion colors until you get a camera that will record 10-bit internally to the card at something like, you know, 150, 200 megabits per second minimum. Okay. It all kind of ties together eventually, somewhere down the line, it all relates back and forth to one another. Okay. And that's really what I want you to know. Okay. This is just a recap of what we just did. So now I wanted to show you, just for conversation, some of the cameras you guys have at UCF and what their bit rates are. Canon 60D, pretty common HD video recorder, 46 megabits per second. Maximum of HD though, no 4K, HD. So 46 megabits, it's okay. It's not great, but it's not bad. Canon 5D. This is also only HD, but it's a full-size image sensor. So you're getting all that data, 4 times as much data as what's coming out of the 60D. Okay, full-size image sensor, full HD, and I think that's 10-bit, 500 megabits per second. A lot more data is coming out of the 5D than is coming out of the 60D. Image files. To this day, we got people that swear they prefer to shoot on a 5D in full HD than some of the less expensive 4K cameras that are out there, because they say, when I play it on my TV, it looks fabulous against a 4K camera with only 100 megabits per second transfer rate. That tells you a lot about how bitrate can affect the quality of your images. Okay. So don't be afraid to shoot with a 5D, even in the age of 4K, because if you're going to put your stuff on TV or YouTube or somewhere on the internet for internet broadcasts like Netflix, that standard is going to be HD exhibition standard. Remember, I asked you a question in the very beginning of the lecture today. What are you going to be looking at your images on? What's your exhibition standard? If it's only TV, then you can still use a 5D and get amazing HD quality images at 500 megabits per second. Okay. And you can rent a 5D for pretty cheap nowadays because everybody's out there scrambling for 4K cameras, and they don't really have to if their exhibition media is TV. Because TV doesn't have a 4K broadcast standard. It's got an HD broadcast standard. Blackmagic Pocket, the original HD, 122 to 184 megabits per second. The new Pocket 4K, 255 to 270. Still less than the 5D. Interesting. It's got a different compression algorithm in it that's more up to date than the 5D has. That's why. Blackmagic Cinema Camera 4K, 312 megabits per second in ProRes HQ. That's standard ProRes HQ, not RAW, ProRes HQ. Sony F3, 35 megabits per second. This is an HD camera. This was considered a very high quality HD camera 10 years ago. Now it's relegated to the dustbin. Nobody wants it. Nobody cares about it anymore. 35 megabits per second. It's okay for HD. You can get a better result out of the 60D. Except this will record 10-bit internally to the card. This one will not. This one's 8-bit. So the color out of the 60D is not as good as the color out of the F3. Tricky. Panasonic EVA 1, you guys were going to get these, but the deal fell through. 100 to 400 megabits per second, depending on the mode. And the Panasonic GH5, 150 to 400 megabits per second. You guys should be getting some of these this year. You should also be getting some of these Pocket 4K cameras this year as well. Okay. Talked about bitrate, talked about sensors, talked about color space. Color space was actually going to be back here. Here's some other cameras, and it tells you what their bit rates are. And this list is actually like, I think 2 years old already. It's got the Panasonic GH4 on it still, 100 megabits per second. But look at stuff up here like the Red 6K, the Wisterium sensor, 1.4 gigabytes per second. And the Wisteria is like 4 years old. Blackmagic 4K camera, that's before the Ursa Mini 4.6K. It's a generation prior. 1.4 gigabytes per second data rate. ProRes 444 is 1.1 gigabytes per second as a compression standard. The Sony F5, F55 professional cinema cameras, a gigabyte per second. Yeah, I got to get a new list because I want to show you guys at some point the newer bit rates of the newer cameras. It's going up and up and up every year exponentially. And interestingly enough, the cameras are getting cheaper while the capabilities are getting better. We're in it's a really great time right now to be a digital filmmaker because the gear is cheap and the technology is getting better by every 6 months. So it's a good time to be a filmmaker right now. Here's a video about understanding codecs. Codec is a portmanteau word. It's a manufactured word. It's a construct of the two terms code and decode. Codec is, so that's a new term for the new millennium. And it refers to styles and methods of compressing data files into smaller data sets, okay? And a very good practical example would be if you're outside, I talked about this earlier, and you take a shot of the desert in the afternoon, you got a big blue sky, mountains in the background, some cactuses in the foreground, a couple of fluffy clouds, and just big blue sky, right? There's a lot of data in the stuff on the ground, in the what are the cactuses and bits and bobs on the ground. There's some detail on the mountains in the background, a little bit of detail in the puffy, fluffy clouds, but not a lot of detail in the blue sky. There's a lot of color gradation, but not a lot of physical resolution, which is directly proportional to pixel count on your sensor. Pixel count contributes to the size of the data file. If every pixel is generating X amount of data and you got millions of them, you're gonna have a lot of data. Blue sky is a lot of redundant data. So a codec and an algorithm within a codec, within a compression standard, the algorithm goes into the data set and it starts looking for redundant data. Blue sky data, blue sky data, blue sky data. We can get rid of 2 of those and just keep 1, and the sky is still blue because there's no real detail there. It's only color. That's basically what's happening with compression. Redundant data is becoming discarded, and the only data that remains is critical data, which tends to be detailed data. Okay, hair, grass, leaves, you know, anywhere where there's detail, fine detail in the image, you got to have a lot of pixels to make sure that detail gets rendered accurately and doesn't look like it's blurry or out of focus. But values like white walls, blue sky, that stuff can be compressed out of an image and shrink the overall size of the data file. That's what codecs and compression are doing for your digital files. Some compression is very aggressive and some compression is very subtle. ProRes HQ is a very subtle compression factor applied to a data file. ProRes LT is an aggressive compression codec, which will reduce dramatically the size of your data files, leaving only the critical detail data intact and removing all the redundant data from the size of the file, giving you a much smaller ultimate file size, but you can do very little in terms of color correction because a lot of that redundant color data has been stripped out of the file. So if you got to do a lot of color correction or a lot of special effects, you need to maintain the size of your data files wherever possible and shoot high resolution, uncompressed files. And then anywhere where you're not going to do a lot of color correction or a lot of manipulation of the image, you can use smaller files. Or if you're shooting 4K resolution and your end game is transferred to 1080p for television broadcast, you could shoot ProRes LT 4K, shrunken 4K files translate to pretty decent HD files at broadcast standard, and you could shoot 4K LT to 1080p for a broadcast product like an interview for 60 minutes. Okay, so it all depends on what your end product is and how it's going to be viewed, right? And then just play games with the data, play games with the specs until you mix and match the camera and the product, and then you're good to go. I don't want to say much more about codecs because that's a rabbit hole. We could go down that for days, and I don't want to do that. So check out this video. It's only 8 minutes, and it gives you a pretty good understanding of what codecs are and what they represent. And that's what I've got for you. I don't have much reading. It's a PDF called Memory Card Basics. And then today I put one in there, which was all you need to know about sensors. Okay, both of those, this is 15 pages. The other one I think is like 7 pages, 6 or 7 pages. Okay, that's it. 2 PDFs in your downloadable PDFs page. If you want to know more about these topics, if you're already kind of hip and up to date with some of what I've been talking about, there is some reading you can do in the Blaine Brown book, The Cinematography Theory and Practice, the 3rd edition. That's the blue cover. I gave it to you on your bookshelf. Read the chapter on cameras and sensors. And he'll take you a little deeper into this conversation. Okay. But that's only optional reading if you want more information. It's not mandatory. Okay. So I beat my time from last night. I know it was like 2 hours, and I know we've only gone about an hour and 15, hour and 20 so far. This is like our longest lecture so far. It's also probably our most complex lecture, right?
Well, it was nice.
Not bad, not too bad, not too scary. Exposure happens after the midterm, and that one will be another long lecture, but again, not really that complicated. But I felt like I had to cover this area with you guys because it's kind of important. It has to do with a lot of your creative choices moving forward. You know, aspect ratios and bit rate and size of cards and different kinds of cameras. It can feel like you got a million weird redundant choices and none of them make any sense. But if you start looking, you know, more closely at what these different elements are and what their specs or capabilities are, it starts making your decisions a little easier because you can disqualify a camera or a data card very quickly by understanding what your finished images are going to be and what they're going to be seen with, right? You can make choices based on specs very easily and eliminate a lot of these options. So it feels like you got a million choices to make and it doesn't make any sense. But when you start whittling down the list based on can't do this, can't do that, can't do this, can't do that, you end up with a very short list of options at that point, and your choices become a lot easier. Okay. Does anybody have any question about this mess?
No, I think I'm good. Thanks.
You're like, just get them off. Get them off the
No,
Zoom.
no. I got something coming. I got something I gotta go do.
Go ahead. I'm pretty much done. So I'm going to Q&A you if you want it. Otherwise, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. So
Thanks.
thank you. So anybody, thoughts, fears, criticisms, questions, random news, gossip? No? Should we adjourn the meeting then? I'm going to stop my screen share.
Yes.
Okay, do I have a second on the motion to adjourn the meeting?
I second that motion.
Second the motion. So we have a motion to end the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate your time and your attention. And I will see you all next week. If you have any questions or anything comes up in the interim, shoot me an email. We can always do a personalized Zoom session if you need extra time or help with these concepts. All right. Check out web courses, and I will talk to you guys next week.
Bye.
Thanks so much, everybody.